Logistics in the American Civil War, a 46-minute presentation held at the Joint Services Command and Staff College, Shrivenham, on the 2nd of April 2009. The speaker is Professor David Kirkpatrick.
I'm going to talk today about one particular aspect of the American Civil War, which sometimes gets a bit concealed behind the battles and the pathos and the glory. The American Civil War between 1861 and 1865. I'll go through introduction. I'll talk a little bit about the background to the war. I'll talk about the logistic requirements and the different supply modes that were used. I'll talk a little bit about the effect of logistics on operations, and then I'll try and sort of carry the lessons forward into operational achievements and problems since the American Civil War, and perhaps then draw a few conclusions. So, the American Civil War is one of the catalytic wars that come in the middle of the 19th century and mark the transition between Napoleonic warfare and World War I. When the American Civil War started, people had bright uniforms. They engaged in massed bayonet charges led by officers on horseback. By the end, it was characterized by trench warfare with mining and not barbed wire entanglements, but certainly wire entanglements. They hadn't invented barbed wire yet, but they discovered that telegraph wire wound round tree stumps served almost as good a purpose against charging infantry. I've mentioned some of the innovations that came in the course of the war in America. Of course, rifles, small arms and artillery were used earlier in the Crimea. Trenches and mining, I've mentioned ironclad warships, not first ironclad warships, but the first battle between ironclad warships in the Chesapeake Bay. Submarines, first operational submarines, naval mines, telegraphic control of armies, which allowed the politicians to interfere and allowed the generals to evade responsibility. And I'll concentrate on the logistics, as I said. In the middle of the 19th century, the United States was divided. Opinion was polarized over the issue of slavery and the extent to which individual states had a right to determine whether there should be slavery or whether there should not. In 1860, 1861, the quarrel boiled over and culminated in a bitter struggle between 25 Union states in the north and west and 11 Confederate states in the south and east. I've provided just a few of the many possible statistics there. Total population, about 2 to 1. White military age population, rather different, about 3 to 1 difference in white military age. The big difference was in manufacturing capability. The Confederacy relied largely on cotton. It was an agricultural economy, producing cotton, rice, tobacco, indigo, stuff like that, much of which was exported. It had very little of an industrial base. Those of you who know Gone with the Wind by heart will remember that Rhett Butler spelt that out to the barbecue at 12 Oaks, where he pointed out that all the Southerners had was courage and arrogance, and they didn't have rolling mills or machine shops or any of the necessities of modern warfare. It's significant, particularly when you're trying to understand and communicate to Americans, because more Americans died in that war, the American Civil War, than in all the other US wars put together. Revolutionary War, Mexican War, War of 1812, War with Spain, World War I, wrap them all together, and the Civil War killed more, largely because medicine was still in its infancy. The science of killing had advanced much faster than the science of healing. So a great many people in the American Civil War died who would have recovered had they been wounded a bit later when people realized more about antisepsis and stuff. The defeated Confederacy suffered a death rate amongst its young men 3 times worse than the UK suffered in World War I. So the great trauma that has led to Poppy Day and the Cenotaph and 2-minute silence and all that was redoubled in spades for the defeated Confederacy, and it ate very deeply into their psyche. Not just was the white military manpower killed off in vast numbers, but the Confederate states were devastated. The economy was wrecked by emancipation and the sudden loss of slavery. The infrastructure was wrecked to the extent that bridges were down, the railways were torn up, the public buildings had been torched. The livestock was depleted. If it hadn't run off, it had been eaten by the passing soldiers, it had been infected by disease. Disease was rampant and made worse by armies passing through the territory. Some of you may be familiar with the surrender negotiation at Appomattox, where General Lee was being dignified in defeat and General Grant was being gracious in victory. General Grant allowed that the Confederates could carry off their swords and stuff. And General Lee asked if the cavalry and the artillerymen could take their horses, because very often they owned their horses rather than being army horses. They'd been supplied by the soldiers themselves. And General Lee wanted them to be able to take the horses home to help with the spring ploughing, and Grant graciously conceded this. It's one of these iconic moments in American history, but in fact, both Lee and Grant would have been kinder had they insisted that every single animal in the surrendered camp was slaughtered, rather than spreading itself all over the Confederacy, carrying the diseases with which it was already infected. This cultural trauma infected the South for a very long time. Even when I went and studied there in the early 1960s, damn Yankee was still one word. And the city of Vicksburg on the Mississippi, which surrendered on the 4th of July, 1863, didn't celebrate the 4th of July with the rest of the nation until after World War II. We had a lady come to lecture us recently at the American Civil War Round Table, an American lady who had grown up in the South, in the town where there was a memorial to the Confederate commandant of a prison camp where the death rate had been particularly high, and he'd been shot as a war criminal, a guy called Wirtz or Witz or something like that. Anyhow, she remembers as a young girl watching carloads of Yankees drive up, stop in the square, get out, spit on this monument and drive off again. And in the evening, the ladies of the town would come out with their mops and their brushes and their sponges, and they'd clean it all up. It lasted for a long time. And it's also lasted because it was the first war in which all the participants, virtually all the participants on both sides, were literate. Some of them couldn't spell, but they could all write. And there is an enormous wealth of memoirs, letters, diaries, documents of all kinds. And the US not having been bombed in the world wars, a lot of this stuff is still coming out of attics and being analysed. There were photographs by the bucket load. Something like 90% of them are now gone because they were on glass, and the glass was used for greenhouses and all sorts of other things. But a sufficient number have survived to give us an impression of what the soldiers actually looked like. We can't be sure what the battlefields actually looked like, because taking a photograph on a battlefield in those days was a difficult business, and some of the pictures of, quote, battlefields, unquote, were posed afterwards and rather unrealistic. And of course it's well known because Hollywood is in America and Hollywood makes films for the American market, so people have seen films like Gone with the Wind and Glory and Birth of a Nation and so forth. And there's been stuff on television as well. There's a map for those of you who like to see where we are. And here is the north and west, the Confederate States, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, Tennessee, 11 of them. They had hoped that other slave states, Missouri, Kentucky, and West Virginia, which was at that time part of the state of Virginia. Virginia was a very large state in those days. But the western Trans-Appalachian bit decided that didn't want to support slavery, and it seceded from secession, if you like, and stayed with the Union and provided lots of soldiers to the Union Army. Kentucky, Missouri were rather more split, as indeed was Maryland. Those border states, which if they had seceded would have balanced up the manpower a bit, stayed with the Union and provided most soldiers to the Union forces. The course of the war was marked by an anaconda strategy, which the Union adopted. Advance from Washington towards Richmond was part of it. Invasion of Tennessee and Georgia along this sort of axis was another. Amphibious warfare down the Mississippi Valley to clear the Mississippi and open up the trade routes that these states in the Northwest, Iowa, Illinois, and so forth, needed to get their produce out to the sea. And all sorts of regular and irregular warfare degenerating into banditry in the far west. That's where Jesse James learnt how to operate. And a naval blockade along the Atlantic and Gulf coasts, which was mounted by the Union Navy. coupled with amphibious attacks, particularly into these areas where there are big inlets and which the South could not seriously defend. Anytime it put a garrison on an island, it was surrounded by Union warships and overwhelmed. Armies, smoothbore muskets replaced by rifled muskets, then on the Union side at least by repeaters late in the war. Cavalry with sabres and shotguns, artillery, both smoothbore cannon that Napoleon would have recognized, but also rifled cannon with a range of miles which are able to harass troops at a distance. Say a little bit about the theatre of operations. 14 slave states, the 11 that did secede and the 3 that didn't, formed a very large area, a real large block. If you exclude the wild wests of Texas and the Florida area, which is mostly swamp, you have a heartland 500 by 900 miles. That's really very big. You have to recall that in the Revolutionary War, when the 13 colonies were a mere strip of territory along the eastern seaboard, no more than 200 miles deep, the 18th century superpower, Great Britain, was unable to conquer them because it was unable to move inland, because it couldn't support its forces away from the coast. Napoleon, with the whole resources of Europe at his disposal, was not able to march on Moscow successfully, and Moscow was only 600 miles from his bases in Poland. So the Confederate politicians could have argued that they were virtually unconquerable. And perhaps, if they'd chosen to secede a few decades earlier, before the railway had been developed as much as it was by the time of the Civil War, they might have been right. But being politicians and perhaps not fully aware of what the revolution in logistics that a railway could bring, they ignored that and went ahead with their secession at the time they did. The area we're looking at is pretty broken, it's pretty varied. It's divided up by mountain ranges with only a few passes, quite difficult for armies to cross. It's divided by bridgeless rivers, which sometimes are passable via fords and sometimes are not. It's got barren areas like the mountains of East Tennessee and the Appalachians, where an army cannot really gather anything worthwhile in the way of provisions. It has to carry with it or be supplied from the rear. What are the roads like? Well, there are only a few roads that the Romans would have regarded as reasonable and tolerable. They were called turnpikes. They had stone foundations, gravel dressing, and they were effectively all-weather roads. All right, serious snowdrifts would stop you, but if you had a turnpike road going in the direction you wanted, you could move troops and wagons along it. But those formed a minority, and they crop up again and again in Civil War literature. They dominate Civil War literature. Stonewall Jackson's campaign in the Shenandoah Valley is governed by the Valley Pike. Who is on the Valley Pike and how far is it from A to B on that turnpike? The other roads were dirt roads, simply mud, farm tracks. They vanished into bottomless gumbo in spring and autumn. It was literally impossible to march or bring a wagon across them. At one point, someone saw that a mule had sunk into the mud so that only its ears were visible. He said, of course, it was a rather small mule. An attempt was made to improve dirt roads by upgrading them to plank roads, which really meant just throwing down logs and other stuff on the top. And that gave you a firm, although pretty uneven surface to march or on a wagon across. It was fine until the wood started to rot, as of course it did, in which case you started to get potholes, serious potholes, where your foot could go right through and you could be injured, and horses could be injured, and wagons could bog down. So moving around by road was pretty difficult. And what were the requirements? Well, the armies of the size that fought at Gettysburg, 80,000 men, 30,000 horses and mules. Soldiers of the time needed about 3 pounds of food and 8 pints of reasonably clean water. Clean water isn't as easily come by in those days as it is now. At the Battle of Wilson's Creek, if you study it, you will find that when the armies came together, the Confederates coming from the south camped, and the Union coming from the north camped. And where was the Confederate cavalry? Was it north or south of the main Confederate encampment? And you'd expect it to be on the north, because that's where the enemy was. But no, it was to the south, because that was downstream, and you wanted to keep the stream reasonably free of what the horses tended to drop in it. So there are practical considerations affecting deployment. You don't always need to have all 3 pounds of food. You can requisition stuff along the way. You can loot chickens and pigs from farmyards if you can get away with it. You can march herds of cattle with the army and slaughter them. This is a slightly extreme number, but most of the time people would need most of that food. And they needed replenishment of other stuff as well, which I've listed: ammunition and stores and clothing and boots and things. So maybe 3 pounds isn't too bad. Horses needed a lot more. If a horse is to stay in reasonably good condition, it needs grain, oats of some kind, it needs hay, and you can substitute that by grazing, but grazing takes time. Grazing, if you're doing it, needs to have the horses turned out into fields, and when they're turned out into fields, they're not marching. And quite a lot of water. Horses need lots of water. Horses didn't last long in the American Civil War. Not only was there disease, but they weren't looked after. They were ridden hard. They weren't cared for as well as they should be. So a typical army needed continuous replacement of horses. Life expectancy of a horse at the front was maybe 2 or 3 months. And they need all sorts of equipment as well. Let's move on to the modes. The standard way of supplying an army was wagons. You had a wagon with 6 horses or mules, generally mules. The amount it could carry varied a good deal, but a good average is 3,000 pounds, depending on the state of the roads, the state of the weather and all that. Speed about 20 miles a day, again depending on the nature of the roads, the gradients encountered and all that. And the mules and the driver will eat up to 150 pounds a day. If they have to be escorted and have to carry food for the escort, then that's an additional charge. So you can see that if the wagon has to go a considerable distance from the depot to the army that it's delivering to, it can eat up most of its load along the way. A typical army of the sort we described on the last slide needs some 450 tons a day of stuff delivered to it. And provided it's reasonably close to its depot, that's 350 wagons or thereabouts. But if it's 100 miles from the depot, then the wagons deliver less, and furthermore, you need a lot more wagons in the pipeline shuffling stuff up from the rear. 10-day round trip, 10 lots of wagons, 7,000 wagons. It's the lucky commander who can dispose of that number of wagons. So no army could go very far from a depot. Wanted to do an advance, you could get the soldiers to carry their own food for a day or two, but once they'd eaten all that, you had to stop and wait for the wagons to catch up and resupply yourself. Railways. Railways were what really made the difference. There were 22,000 miles in the Union States, rather less in the South. One train can carry 120 tons in almost all weathers. It doesn't need to be supplied with anything. It runs on water and wood. And the United States in that time was covered with water and wood. You can get it off the side of the track. Properly organized railroads had dumps of stuff which they could draw on, but it wasn't really difficult to cut a tree or find a dead tree and restock your tender. The track was poor, so the speeds weren't great, but you'll be doing 20 miles an hour instead of 20 miles a day, and that's a big difference. If the typical army we've described needed only 4 trains to supply it 100 miles from its depot, vastly more economic than all those wagons. Railways were vulnerable to raiding, but they weren't too difficult to repair. There wasn't anything that a Confederate cavalryman could do to a railway that a Union engineer couldn't fix in less than a day. It was much more difficult for the Confederacy to fix railways because they didn't have spare rails. They very often had to straighten the rails out again if they'd been bent. And in the latter part of the war, the Yankees realized that they could make the rails beyond repair by having a nice bonfire, putting the rails on top and twisting them. You can't sort that out without a rolling mill. So it depends on the capability of your repair crew, but in general, railways were pretty invulnerable. Steamboats were the other important mode. A typical river steamboat can carry 500 tons. Some steamboats were bigger, some steamboats were smaller. And steamboats were pretty invulnerable to raids. You can't get at a steamboat that's going down the middle of the Mississippi. They could be stopped by fog or ice or low water. They took a long time because they had to follow the winding courses of the river, and going upriver was much slower than coming down. But generally, steamboats could carry a lot of stuff. They could support amphibious landings, and they could move supplies forward. And I'll talk a little bit about how that influenced the campaign in Tennessee later. Ocean-going steamships the Union used to mount its amphibious raids on the Confederate coast. They were vulnerable to storms, and some of them were lost, and some of them were late, but they were a good way of moving large quantities of stuff. It was important to keep track of the interfaces. If you were using railways and steamboats and steamships, the supplies had to be brought to a railhead or a depot and then offloaded into wagons for distribution to the front line. And it was absolutely vital to organize those interfaces efficiently. Sometimes lots of trains would arrive when there weren't any wagons, so the supplies were offloaded and left to rot in the rain. Sometimes the local military commander commandeered the loaded railroad trucks, taking them out of service to use them as temporary warehouses. So that took them out of service and it blocked the track. And landing supplies across an open beach was really hairy. Let's talk now a little bit about the operational impact of logistics, first on the Union Army. In order for the Union to win, it needed a superior force to invade and occupy the Confederacy and the ability to supply itself as it advanced. That meant generally advancing with a lot of wagons. General Grant in the Wilderness Campaign of 1864 had a train of 4,000 wagons. That stretched for 65 miles if it all been on one road, pretty well the entire distance from Washington to Richmond. So managing that supply train, getting it across rivers and allowing it to keep up with the army was a real problem. In fact, it could be argued that because the supply train slowed him down, Grant failed to get through the wilderness before Lee's army was able to engage it at an advantage. And one of the many cases where raids on a depot changed the course of a campaign, General Pope, invading northern Virginia in 1862, had assembled a great depot at Manassas Junction, which was then attacked and raided by the Confederates, totally wrecked, all the supplies looted, and Pope was unable to advance further. He had to fall back to restore his supply line. Grant had the same trouble at Holly Springs in the Mississippi Valley in 1863. In the 1862 campaign, the Union Army was able to advance 300 miles to conquer most of Tennessee in 3 months. And it was able to do that because it was advancing along the line of the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers, and it was able to bring up supplies by steamboat very readily to keep up with the advancing armies. Later, the same Army of Tennessee took 8 months to advance 80 miles from Stones River towards Chattanooga because it advanced in stages. It would advance a few miles and then wait till the railroad had been rebuilt. Then it would advance another few miles and wait for the railroad. Later on, when Sherman got that army properly organized, he had the railway being built continuously behind his advancing troops, so that it was said that as the Confederate rearguards fell back, they could hear the whistle of the Union locomotives bringing up fresh rations and supplies and stuff. In addition to supplying advancing armies, the Union utilized the railroad for strategic transfer, moving 2 Army Corps from Culpeper in Virginia to Bridgeport, quite near Chattanooga in Tennessee, within a week. And the Union realized, quite late in the war, that it could defeat the Confederacy by destroying its logistic base, not necessarily by targeting the armies in the field, like Clausewitz would have wanted it to, but by aiming at the underbelly of the Confederate economy. So Sherman's march through Georgia destroyed crops, railroads, bridges, public buildings, everything that couldn't be carried off. And at about the same time, General Sheridan went into the Shenandoah Valley and instructed his troops that they were to create a devastation such that a crow flying over it would have had to carry its own rations. Let's now look at the Confederate railway system, which is one of the things I find intriguing. The first thing to say is that this railway system was utterly unsuited to war. First of all, the network, such as it was in Florida, and the railways west of the Mississippi were not connected to the main line. There were strategic gaps there. Greensboro-Danville Gap, which was not, in fact, bridged until extremely late in the war. That meant that anything coming from the Deep South up to the battlefront in Virginia had to come round through vulnerable Knoxville, which fell in September 63, or had to follow the coast road through Wilmington and then up this way, up the Weldon Railroad, very vulnerable to Union forces pushing in from the coast. So although this gap was a visible problem from the very beginning of the war, it took the Confederacy 3 years to bridge it, largely because they were doing it with rails that were being ripped up from another railway and carried over and used. There was also a gap in Alabama. If you wanted to get from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi Valley, the only way you could do it was to follow the Charleston and Memphis up this way to Memphis. But once Corinth fell, and Corinth fell in May 62, then the only way to do it was to come along this way as far as Montgomery. Once you got to Montgomery, then you either had to take a long rail journey down here to Tensas, ferry across Mobile Bay, and then another long rail journey backwards up to Meridian and then Jackson and Vicksburg. Or from Montgomery, you could take a steamboat ride down the river, get off at Selma, join the railway again, take a ferry across the Tombigbee, join the railway again, and westward. Really painful process. I've written a short piece called Slow Train to Vicksburg on the possibility that the Confederacy might have been able to send troops westward in order to reinforce the Vicksburg area when it was under threat from General Grant in May-June 1863, and concluded that they probably couldn't. The other feature of the Confederate railways is that they're seriously undercapitalized. There was insufficient investment per mile of railway relative to northern railways. And that varied a good deal from some railways in the Atlantic states, which were pretty well as good as their northern counterparts, to the archetypal right-of-way and 2 streaks of rust. In general, Confederate railroads had lighter rails, less double track, fewer facilities, fewer rolling stock, and couldn't carry as much. Another really serious problem was that there were no Union stations. One railroad would come in at one side of town and another railroad would go out at the other. That meant if you were trying to move troops through the town, you had to get them off the train at one end, march them through the town, keeping them out of the saloons and going to visit their cousins, and get them on a train at the other side. And if you think that's difficult, consider the situation of horses. The horses needed for artillery batteries and supply wagons. Those of you who have pony-mad daughters know that horses and vehicles do not go well together. And if a horse has been in a wagon for a couple of days and it then is allowed off onto firm ground and fresh air and taken for a little walk through the town and faced with the prospect of getting into another wagon on the other side, it becomes an unhappy and uncooperative beast. So shifting cavalry and artillery was difficult. The situation was even more difficult if there was a ferry involved. Sometimes there'd be a river through the center of town and you'd have to ferry everybody across. Where there wasn't a river, the Confederacy realized that it would be a really good idea to link up these railways, either by running a loop round the town or even rails through the middle. But these initiatives were resisted by local opinion. There were teamsters who made a living hauling freight from one side of town to the other. There were hoteliers, saloon keepers, other even more dubious professions that relied on people spending the night and who would influence the town council and the railway companies against any building of a railway. Eventually, Petersburg, Virginia, up here, very important rail junction, the town agreed that a railway could be built through the town, but insisted that the rails would be torn up as soon as victory was won. And this made the railway company a bit reluctant to invest. So the railroad had its problems. One of the consequences of the inadequacy of the railway was that the victory at First Bull Run in 1861 couldn't be followed up. The Confederates couldn't march on Washington, which they might have done on the heels of the retreating Union Army, but they had simply no supplies, and the railroad running back to their depots was insufficient to bring up stuff. In fact, the railroads of Virginia were so poor that General Lee's army at Fredericksburg over the winter of 62-63 virtually starved because there was no way of bringing enough trains up the line from Richmond to Fredericksburg and beyond, a mere 50-mile trip. For that reason, part of the Army of Northern Virginia, 2 divisions, were sent south into southeastern Virginia to forage for hams and horses and things, and were not available to fight at Chancellorsville. And the strained Confederate logistics meant that when the army moved north for the vital Gettysburg campaign, General Lee had at least two different objectives in mind. Political objectives, maybe military objectives of catching and defeating the Union Army in disarray, but also a logistic objective to collect as much cattle, horses, grain, everything else that he could lay his hands on in fertile Pennsylvania. And this meant that when the chance encounter came at west of Gettysburg, General Lee's army was spread all over the map and unable to concentrate as rapidly as it would have needed to in order to achieve a success. The Confederates used railway for strategic reinforcement. They moved folk from Piedmont Station to Manassas quite early in the war, small contingent but crucial to win the first victory of the war. They redeployed in the Western Theater, moving people from Tupelo, Mississippi to Chattanooga, Tennessee, and the more famous one, sending Longstreet's corps west from Virginia to fight at Chickamauga, 965 miles, that long roundabout route through the Carolinas, through Georgia and up again. Again, that is featured in Gone with the Wind. Transfer speeds were lower because of the inadequate railway system. And I mentioned the reinforcements from Atlantic Coast and Tennessee couldn't get to the Mississippi Valley in time to be effective. And I mentioned the problems of artillery and supply units. Some of the lessons of the American Civil War continue to resonate. In the Boer War in South Africa, the British found themselves relying on railways and on ox carts. The ox carts were, if anything, even slower than American Civil War wagons, and the oxen died even more rapidly than American Civil War horses. So it was a very unsatisfactory and difficult way of supporting an army. They tended, therefore, to use the railways in South Africa, but there were even fewer railways in South Africa, and each railway, at some point, bumped into a good position that the Boers could fortify and wait for the British to bump into them and get shot down. So tying yourself to a railway was not a good way to advance. The other hazard was the fords across South African rivers, fords called drifts locally. These are sort of shingle banks that have formed over the ages, and I don't fully understand the reason. But apparently, if you can take one wagon across, you can take 6 wagons across. If you try to take a score of wagons across, you disturb the river's flow and the profile of the ford sufficiently that the whole thing vanishes downstream in a cloud of pebbles and mud, and you have to wait months for it to reform again and become passable. So British encountered in South Africa virtually the same problems as the American Civil War. The Russians, in the war against Japan, demonstrated that a railway, albeit a not entirely satisfactory railway, would allow you to deploy and supply very large numbers of men a very long distance from their bases. And that got the attention of the government of India because they realized that it was no further, in fact it was shorter from Moscow to the Khyber Pass than it was between Moscow and Vladivostok. So if the Russians could supply an army in Manchuria, they could certainly supply an army on the borders of India. In 1914, the Germans discovered what the American Civil War discovered, is that horse-drawn wagons cannot support a rapid advance, because they can't keep up with the advancing troops until the troops are held up by the enemy, and even then they can't sustain those troops at a sufficient distance from the railheads. The Germans found themselves unable to move railheads through Belgium and northern France as fast as the advancing armies, and it wasn't until the advancing armies fell back after the First Battle of the Marne that the Germans were able to resupply themselves and fight properly. In the Second World War, lorry transport had come along instead of horses and wagons, but it too is limited. Lorries can carry a limited amount. They burn quite a lot of their own load. They can't forage for petrol and oil and stuff along the wayside. They have to carry it with them or devise some means of supplying. And really, you can only do a blitzkrieg, lorry supported, over relatively short ranges, about 200 miles. German frontier to the Somme and the Channel is one bound. From the Somme southwards into France, Paris and a bit beyond is a reasonable bound. You can do Poland from pretty well any direction. It's not big distances. Once you start dealing with big distances like Russia or North Africa, lorry columns are not sufficient. And the Germans found that they could only sustain their advance into Russia by converting the railways onto the right gauge. However, they found it was a much more difficult problem than that because they'd advanced along the roads with their panzer divisions. The Russians had retreated along the railways with plenty of time to wreck the signal boxes, wreck the water towers, wreck the signalling equipment, generally create mayhem. So getting the Russian railways back into service was a problem. But it was only after those railways were restored that the Germans could resume their advance on Moscow. And by then, of course, it was too late. We found in the Falklands that shipping stuff to the South Atlantic in large ships is relatively easy. The real difficulty, just as the American Civil War people found, was the interface between ship and shore and between ship and tactical transport, if you like, moving stuff over inhospitable terrain without good roads. Conclusions. Supply problems have got worse since the American Civil War. An American Civil War division could subsist on 30 tons a day. In the Gulf War, something between 2,000 and 6,000 tons a day, depending on the level of activity. The ideal soldier for any war is someone who is hardy and frugal, doesn't want lots and lots of comforts, doesn't want lots and lots of food. His ideal equipment ought to be light so that it's easily carried, it ought to be reliable so it doesn't need a great stock of spares, and it ought to be low consumption, not heavy on ammunition, not heavy on fuel, not heavy on batteries or anything else. The ideal supply mode is fast, flexible, economical, immune to disruption, and most are actually a compromise between these. Inevitably, people have to use a mix of modes, and the interfaces remain difficult, and the capacity of a supply line is set by its worst bottleneck. That goes without saying. It's arguable that through-life capability management of any defence equipment project ought to take an explicit account of its logistic requirements on operations. Some equipment that the UK forces, or indeed any other national forces, might be planning to buy, are moved and supported relatively easily. Other types of equipment, which might be seen as alternatives to do the same job, could be moved more difficult. You need to balance not only the characteristics of the equipment itself, but the scale of logistics support that is needed to deploy and support it. And I've been arguing, so far I think unsuccessfully, that the logistic requirements ought to be built in to through-life capability management assessment. And I'll leave that thought with you.
Professor Kirkpatrick was asked the following 4 questions. Question 1. In the American Civil War, to what extent do you see the emergence of specific military organisations to overcome the difficulties associated with the interface between the different modes of transport?
Certainly, on the Union side, they set up an organisation called US Military Railroads, which was bossed by a guy called Haupt, who was a manager come entrepreneur, would have fitted in quite well in the modern business environment. And he was fully prepared to override military officers, no matter how much grade or decorations they had, to insist on the railway being run properly and the interfaces being properly managed. The Confederacy never managed to achieve anything like the same organisation, partly because it had over 100 railways within the states, and the states themselves clung vigorously to their independence. They saw themselves as being separate states with their own interests and axes to grind. So the Confederate transportation system was never properly coordinated and run in an efficient way. There were also economic pressures, which meant that moving civilian freight could be more profitable than moving military freight, and who's to insist on what happens on a railway without declaring martial law, which for a revolution is a bit unpopular and difficult, and the Confederate government was never able to do it. The short answer to your question is yes, the North was able to organise itself more efficiently, as indeed it had to, because it was on the offensive, the Confederacy less so.
Question 2. Lawrence of Arabia successfully waged irregular warfare against the Turks. Did the Confederates attempt to do something similar?
The Confederates did it continuously. They had deep cavalry raids that went 100, 200 miles into Union territory, attacked the railways, attacked the depots. The difficulty was that for a rapid-moving cavalry raid, it's not easy to carry large quantities of engineering equipment. And the Union developed very rapid repair schemes. They had engineers, plate layers, spare rails by the ton, which could come up and mend almost any damage that the Confederates could do. They could construct bridges. Even soldiers in the army, not trained engineers, could build a bridge. There's some marvelous pictures of a big trestle bridge built out of timber, just hacked from the surrounding forest and held together. The organization was such that one Confederate proposed destroying the tunnels on Sherman's line of advance, and it was argued against him that there's no point destroying tunnels. Sherman has 3 or 4 more in his back pocket. The Union could just throw resources at it. The Confederacy could not. The Confederacy had very little in the way of iron production, and after it lost Tennessee, it had even less. And railroad ties were being ripped up hither and yon and used to armour gunboats. The ironclad gunboat, easiest way to armour it is to nail some railroad iron around it. Casting armour is ideal, yes, but you need a forge and a rolling mill and all sorts of stuff for that. You can improvise stuff with railroad iron. There was just not enough iron about in the Confederacy for them to do this sort of repair. And the Union raiders, particularly Sherman working round Atlanta through Jonesboro and so forth, could tear up the railways, twist the rails, and that railroad was out of action for the rest of the war. So I guess the Turks were closer to the Confederate position in not having sufficient repair to put things right. You have exactly the same phenomenon in World War II. A large tonnage of bombs was dropped on the marshalling yards of Ham, and it's simply a matter of throwing in a few shovels of gravel and laying fresh rails on top.
Question 3. Was the Union Anaconda strategy present from the start, or was that the response to a failure to achieve a decisive tactical approach?
It was present at the start in the minds of the officer who was Union Commander-in-Chief at the time, General Scott, who appreciated the multidimensional nature of the problem and the need to come at the Confederacy from all directions. But there was considerable opinion that this rebellion was a paper tiger and could be brushed aside at one bold stroke, and the cry of "On to Richmond" resounded in the northern newspapers, and a great deal of political opinion felt that all you had to do was to get enough men and push them in the direction of Richmond, and Richmond would fall, and that would be a public relations disaster as well as an industrial disaster, because the Tredegar Ironworks in Richmond was the major source of iron for the Confederate States. And it wasn't until several successive generals had tried this process of coming from Washington to Richmond, which isn't as easy as it sounds, because there are rivers running all the way across, successive river lines, and the only way you can do is either come along the coast, which makes it difficult to cross the rivers every time and keep supplying yourself by sea, or take a big loop inwards where you have the sort of supply problems that I've described. So failures of successive Union advances into Virginia probably meant that more and more people came to recognize the virtues of the Anaconda strategy, besides which it had advantages, political advantages, operating down the Mississippi Valley, because it secured support of the northwestern states, and raiding onto the southern mainland from the Atlantic coast inland provided opportunities for loot. If you found cotton, you could confiscate it. You could only confiscate it if it belonged to the Confederate government. You couldn't confiscate private property. But it didn't take much ingenuity before somebody came up with a stamp which said Confederates, and then another stamp which said seized by the U.S. Navy. So this was CSA, Confederate States of America, overprinted USN, was changed to Cotton Stealing Association of the United States Navy. If you could lay your hands on cotton and you could ship it north, you'd get a very good price for it. So there were all sorts of advantages, both military and personal, in this Anaconda strategy. The Confederacy could not defend all its coastline adequately against a hard punch. Perhaps the most critical was the one that took New Orleans in the spring of '62, and that was one of the biggest towns in the South, source of recruits, manufacturing, everything else.
Question 4. How much of the Confederate railway system was single track?
Oh, most of it. And different gauges too. I may not have mentioned that sufficiently, but different gauges in different parts of the country, and so you very often had to change. Sometimes even when the gauge is the same, the railroad company changed. You'd have to change. And coordinating all of this in the days before mobile phones and faxes was a real nightmare. Anyway, I hope I've given you some idea of the complexity of logistics in the American Civil War, but how the basic lessons of having a transport mode which doesn't consume its own load en route is important and remains important.
Professor Kirkpatrick can be contacted by email at kpbroadoak@gmail.com. Please note that any views expressed in this presentation are entirely and solely those of the speaker, and do not necessarily reflect the official thinking and policy of their organisation, Her Majesty's Government, or the Ministry of Defence.